In this video, we're going to take a look at frequency modulation, what it is and how it can affect your sound dramatically. So up to this point, we've been combining oscillators whenever we've wanted a more complex sound, putting 2, 3, 4, or even more together to make a sound. This is one way to do it, but if you want a really complex, really strange, harmonically rich sound, you can do that with just 2 oscillators. But instead of 2 of them combined together, both as carriers, you could use one to affect the other. This is where we'll be using an oscillator not as a carrier, but as a modulator. And that frequency from that oscillator will modulate the original oscillator that's actually carrying the sound. This is known as frequency modulation, where you're using the frequency of one oscillator to modulate the other. And it is the basis of some more modern synthesized sounds. So let's take a look at how to connect this up. So I've reduced our example down to just some basic blocks. I've got an oscillator going into a filter, which is then going into the VCA, being controlled by an envelope, of course. It's set to a saw wave and it has a very basic sound at the moment. This basic sound can be dramatically changed though with frequency modulation. Let's grab the oscillator and drop it in underneath this one, and we're going to use this one as the modifier and this one as the carrier. I'm going to grab the output from this one and I'm going to attach it to an FM slot on my original one. And just for sake of keeping it neat and organized, I'm going to change it to orange, which I like to have all my FM settings as. Now, right now it's doing absolutely nothing because the FM slider is at the bottom. So if I play a sound, we'll just hear the sawtooth wave by itself. But if I play a sound and increase this FM knob, you're going to hear some very wild sounds. The reason for this is a sine wave is being sent into the saw wave and mashing it together, which is creating a very different wave when you add those two things together. There's a lot of theory that goes behind this, and if you're interested, you can certainly look more into it. But for our purposes, all we need to know is this modulation is dramatic. Right now, it's got a very wobbly sound, and that's because the modulator oscillator, the one that's doing the FM to the carrier, that one is set to the lowest speed of oscillation. If I connect the pitch to that oscillator as well, it means the pitch will move up and down with the other oscillator. To start with, let me show you what happens when I move around the keyboard with some FM without that pitch. So if I increase the FM a little bit and move around the keyboard. Some very wild sort of sounds. But let me now connect the pitch and see what that does. Let's connect the pitch there, and I'm going to change that one to yellow so that I know that it's a pitch cable. And let's see what happens now. It's still a wild sound, it still sounds very unusual, but it's much more controlled. It's more consistent across the whole keyboard. So I'd recommend using that pitch because then it gets a little bit more controllable throughout the rest of the keyboard. The other thing that is recommended with FM synthesis is to use a sine wave as your modifier or your modulator, not to change it to saw wave or square wave or something else. The reason for that is that frequency modulation can get very dramatic and wild very quickly, and a sine wave is complex enough without making it even more complex. Let me just change it to a saw wave and see what happens, so one saw wave affecting another. Quite dramatic, you can see. Let me try with a square wave. Really getting crazy out there. So you can definitely use these, but sine waves are more subtle if you're going for a more subtle sound. So I've changed it back to a sine wave, and now I'm going to adjust the FM to just the right level that I like, that creates a nice balanced sound that doesn't feel too unstable but is quite harmonically rich. So I'll pull that all the way out, I'm going to play a note and dial in something that I like. That sounds crazy. It's definitely breaking up and sounds really, really gnarly, but it still sounds in tune. And that's one thing that can get a little bit carried away with FM as well, is that when you find a particular frequency in there, it can be a little bit too out of tune and therefore not as usable musically. However, frequency modulation is an absolute dream when it comes to sound design and creating weird sort of textures and ambient sort of sounds, because it does really create some fantastic and unusual things. So thanks for sticking with this course. You've now seen a lot of different ways that you can modulate your synthesizer with modular synthesis. In the next video, we're going to take a look at another sound example in another sound break, where we take all this modulation knowledge and put together something even more complex than the last one.